Okay, good. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Henry George School. This should be session 4 of our course, Land Value Return and Recycling for Prosperity, Sustainability, and Equity with Rick Ryback from Just Economics LLC, a Washington, DC-based consultancy. So, as we did during the past sessions, we'll follow the same procedures. We'll have Rick present his slides, and then we'll open up for a very long Q&A session. And in the meantime, you have questions. The chat option is always available. Just drop me a line and I'll be able to take it. If it requires me interrupting Rick, I would do it. Otherwise, we'll wait until we get to the Q&A session. And as you could see on the screen, we count on your support to keep giving our free courses. If you feel like you can be of any help, visit our website, henrygeorgeschool.org, and there is a donate button there. Thank you very much. So without further delay, I'm gonna let Rick step in. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ibrahima. And I'm going to share my screen at this point, and we'll get into the main presentation. So people can see the screen. Can people see my cursor?
Yes, we do.
Okay, great. And if everybody would be so kind as to mute your microphones, that will improve the quality of the experience for everybody. We'll have a chance to unmute people during the Q&A period. And again, very glad that you could all join. If there's a problem that needs my immediate attention, please put something in the chat and Ibrahima will take care of that and will interrupt me in real time if necessary. Otherwise, he'll call on you at the end for questions. So without further ado, this is the structure of our program for the last several weeks. We're tonight in class number 4, talking about examples of implementation regarding land value return and recycling. So in our earlier classes, we talked a lot about economic theory, but tonight we'll talk about real world examples. So first, just a brief overview. We talked last week about value capture. And as I mentioned, a lot of people have defined that term in a very sloppy way, or not at all. And so just for the sake of making sure we're all on the same page, I have defined value capture very simply. And that's simply value given for value received. So in a way, if you think of any economic transaction, let's say I make a hamburger and you want it, well, you have to give me something of value for me to give you the hamburger. And if you give me something of value, when I give you the hamburger, I've captured some value, if you will, for producing the hamburger. So that's value capture. Value given for value received. And our discussion has been primarily about the public sector. And the public sector practices value capture through 2 main avenues. The first is user fees. And I think most of us are familiar with user fees. If you drive on a highway and there's a toll and you pay the toll, that's a user fee. If you get on a transit bus or a subway and pay a fare, that's a user fee. If you get a water bill and it charges you by the gallon, that's a user fee. So we're pretty familiar with those. The other avenue for value capture are access fees. And I refer to this as land value return. And people tend to be a little less familiar with access fees. So again, going to an example we used before, we're familiar with the idea of paying for water by the gallon. It makes sense. It creates incentives for us to conserve water or fix leaky faucets. But what about the person who owns a vacant lot? They're not drinking any water or flushing any toilets, at least at that vacant lot. So should they pay anything to the Water and Sewer Authority? And what we've said in prior sessions is Well, if the Water and Sewer Authority has pipes at the property boundary, by doing that, they've conferred some value on that lot. They've made it more valuable as a place to develop, either for residential or commercial use, simply because those pipes are nearby and accessible. So to the extent that the Water and Sewer Authority, simply by constructing and maintaining pipes at the property boundary, the property owner, even though they're not drinking or flushing any water, should pay the Water and Sewer Authority in exchange for the value that they've created on that property. So just filling in land value return and recycling, when infrastructure is well designed and well executed, it inflates the price of nearby land. And returning that publicly created land value to the public sector that created it and recycling it for infrastructure creation, operation, and maintenance, that is what we mean by the term land value return and recycling. And we came up with this diagram. Last week, somebody gave me some suggestions for improving it. It might have been Marty Rowland or Ed Dodson, and I think those were good suggestions. I haven't had a chance to do it yet, but I will as soon as I get time. But just a quick brief overview for those who weren't at previous sessions. This is the public, this upside down triangle, comprised of both tenants and landowners. And again, tenants are not only residential tenants, but businesses. I would say probably somewhere in the realm of 90% of businesses are tenants. They don't own the land on which their buildings, on which their business resides. So the public is paying taxes on labor and capital to the government. The government is using those taxes to create public goods and services. Those public goods and services in turn create land value. And a very small amount of that trickles back through the traditional property tax. The lion's share of land value ends up as a windfall, primarily to the owner of prime sites. And prime sites are those sites that are best served by public infrastructure. And the thing that we noticed that was sort of interesting about this depiction of the status quo is that it shows that most people end up paying at least twice for infrastructure. First, they pay through their taxes. But if they want to take advantage of the infrastructure their taxes have paid for by locating their home or their business next to the new interchange or the new transit station, they go to a prime site and they have to pay a big rent premium to get access to the infrastructure they've already paid for. And what we've proposed in terms of land value return and recycling is something that looks more like this. Here, as you can see, the return of land value to the public sector is more robust. And as a consequence, taxes on labor and capital can be reduced, which makes the economy more productive and more vibrant. And getting to that weird situation we talked about at the end of the last slide, the rents that people pay to access the infrastructure they paid for are lower because instead of this land value becoming a windfall to the owners of prime sites, it goes back to the government, which means that land prices and rents are lower than under the status quo. So this is what we mean by land value return and recycling. This is a little overview of the theory. And now let's talk about how it's worked in the real world. And I don't know about most of you, but as for me, when I'm really interested in finding examples of innovation, I look back into history to find it. So the first example will be about the paving of streets and sidewalks. In the mid-1800s, streets in Washington, D.C. were mostly unpaved. And the roads were very dusty, and in wet weather, the mud made travel difficult and unpleasant. So paving the streets and sidewalks was a tremendous advance. It made properties more accessible. It made the air cleaner. Indeed, everybody benefited. So why not just pay for the paving of streets out of general tax revenues? Well, Congress of the United States, which is in control of the District of Columbia, decided in the 1800s that some people received a direct and special benefits that were not available to the general public. So for example, somebody who lived in New York City or Philadelphia could own a property in Washington, D.C. And they might never walk on that newly paved street or sidewalk, and yet they would get a special benefit. And what would those benefits be? Well, no longer would people be tracking dust, mud, and manure into their homes and places of business. And as a result, these landowners could charge higher rents or obtain higher sales prices for their land. So in 1894, Congress enacted a law that required adjacent property owners to pay 50% of the cost of the first-time paving of streets, gutters, curbs, and sidewalks through a special assessment. Here's another example, again from the 1800s in California. Much of California is a desert, and yet today it provides an enormous amount of vegetables and fruits that we consume. And this was all made possible because in the mid-1800s, people began to divert water from various rivers to irrigate both the central and imperial valleys of California. Now, the initial attempts were funded by user fees. In other words, they metered how many gallons of water farmers along the irrigation canals would withdraw from the canal, and people paid according to that. But in the 1880s, it was discovered that some landowners were getting rich from the system without making any contribution. And how was this possible? Well, what happened was that some large landowners next to the canals simply let their land lie fallow. They didn't withdraw any water. They weren't growing any crops or didn't have any orchards or vineyards. They just did nothing. But because their land had access to water, it was now much more valuable than it had been before. And yet they were paying little or no water fees. So they were making lots of money from the system without paying for it. So as a result, people took action. The Right Act of 1887, which allowed farmers to establish these water districts, was amended in 1909 to permit, and then again in 1917 to require that all properties benefiting from the irrigation canals contribute toward their operation and maintenance through a fee based on land value only, and not on the value of crops, vineyards, orchards, buildings, etc. So as a result, large land holdings ended up being carved up into smaller but intensively farmed operations. And that's because once these large landowners had to pay based on land value, it was too expensive for them to keep the land lying idle. Senator William Noland, who was a senator from California in the 1950s, talked about the Right Act as being more important to the growth of California than the discovery of gold. And here's an interesting quote. He says, "It taxes people into instead of out of business." I'm sure many of you listening have heard people complain that taxation creates a hardship for people and oftentimes puts businesses out of business. But here's a tax that encouraged people who were sitting on idle land to put that land into use. Quite interesting. Now, this is an example we talked about last time, but I'll bring it up again because it's a good example. A lot of people have heard about transit-oriented development. Well, I'm going to do a little riff on that and talk about development-oriented transit. So in the 1890s, the Chevy Chase Land Company bought 1,700 acres of land on the northwest side of the District of Columbia, right along the border with DC and Maryland. And this land was on both sides of the border. This land was very cheap. It was all farm and forest land. And it was cheap because it was difficult to get to the jobs and the shops that were in downtown Washington. Let's see here. Now, the Chevy Chase Land Company at its own expense, constructed a streetcar line from downtown DC out to its land holdings in the northwest quadrant, and they charged a few pennies for people to ride the streetcar. Now, this small fare probably covered the cost of the conductor, but there's no way that this fare covered the cost of the rails or the streetcars themselves. Now, was the Chevy Chase Land Company being charitable or altruistic, just giving this away? Absolutely not. The Chevy Chase Land Company recouped its capital costs because the land that it bought so cheaply was now much more valuable for homes and businesses now that there was cheap and convenient access to the downtown. And here's something really important to think about, because I'm sure many people in our audience tonight have heard people complain about transit, complain about how it's subsidized, and you've probably heard some critics say it's not fair that I should pay for transit when I don't ride it. We should get the riders to pay everything, and we should just raise the fares. Well, let's apply that thinking to this example. If the Chevy Chase Land Company had attempted to recoup all of the costs of the streetcar through the fare box, the fares would have been so expensive that nobody would have ridden it. And in that case, both the streetcar and the land development projects would have failed. So when we think about user fees and access fees, or land value return, it's very important that we get the balance right between the two. And in this case, the Chevy Chase Land Company got the balance right. The cheap fares for transit encouraged people to ride it, and that made their land more valuable, and that's how they recovered, and more than recovered, their costs. Disaster recovery is another example for land value return recycling. In 1906, San Francisco suffered from a terrible earthquake, and even more devastation was caused by the fires that ensued than by the quake itself. At that time, there was no federal emergency management agency, and there were no federal grants to provide for disaster recovery. And yet, in spite of the lack of that agency and the lack of federal grants, San Francisco was quickly rebuilt as a compact and vibrant city. How did this happen? Well, in part, it's because San Francisco's property tax was very minimal on buildings and mostly on land value. After the disaster, taxes remained high, and landowners needed to rebuild quickly in order to generate income from which to pay their taxes. Here's an example of disaster prevention. And when I'm going to talk about the Miami River, the thing to remember is the Miami River is not in Florida. The Miami River is in Ohio. And during the 17 and 1800s, there were frequent and serious floods along that river, which caused a great deal of hardship and injuries and deaths. And after a large flood in 1913, a very young civil engineer, Arthur Morgan, was hired to design a flood prevention system for that area. And he created the Miami Conservancy District. It was formed in 1915. And what they did was they built a series of dry dams. Now, what these dry dams were is the big, typical earthen dams with pipes at the bottom. So during normal time, the Miami River just flowed right through the dam unimpeded. But in the spring, when the snow was melting, or if there was an occasional period of unusually heavy downpours, and the river volume was high, well, the pipes under the dams weren't big enough to let the water through. So during those flood times, the water would then back up and create a lake behind the dry dam. And these lakes stored the water in a controlled way to avoid the damage and the loss of life that happened before. So the Miami Conservancy District and its dams were funded by a special assessment on the nearby properties, which were the beneficiaries of the dams. And basically, their value increased because there was less of a risk of flood damage. And it was that increase in value, which was a direct benefit from the flood control. And that direct benefit then was returned to the conservancy district rather than being a windfall for the property owners. So in this way, disaster prevention became a financially self-sustaining enterprise. Our next example is about affordable economic vitality. Now, a lot of us are familiar with places like Seattle, Silicon Valley, New York, Boston, Washington, D.C., places where the economy is booming. And one of the things that we note about these areas is that housing is very, very expensive. And even though people are making decent wages, for example, in Silicon Valley, a household making a six-figure income has a difficult time finding decent and affordable housing. So we sort of find that in some of these affluent and very vibrant economic regions, it's kind of like we're on a hamster wheel. We're getting more money, but we can't catch up because the cost of land and housing and business sites goes up faster than our incomes. Well, in the early 1900s, Pittsburgh was not a thriving city. It was a small city, but it was very well positioned to become the epicenter of steel manufacturing. Iron ore could be delivered by barge and train from its sources nearby in the Great Lakes region. Coal for the furnaces was right there in Pennsylvania and nearby West Virginia. And the markets for the finished steel were either on the East Coast, a short train ride away, or in the South, where the steel could be shipped by barge down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. So Pittsburgh was a great place for a steel factory. There was one big problem. You need flat land for steel factories. And I don't know if anybody in the audience is familiar with Pittsburgh, but there's not a lot of flat land in Pittsburgh. It's pretty hilly there. But there is some flat land right along the riverbanks. But this land was controlled by a very few number of families, and they were asking exorbitant prices when the steel companies wanted to get access to it. So the steel companies went to the city council in Pittsburgh, and they said, you know, these families who are asking exorbitant prices for land, they're holding up progress for your city. And what you should do is reduce the property tax on buildings and increase the tax on land. And if you did that, land hoarders, land speculators wouldn't be able to hold on to their land, and people like us could do more business in your city. In 1913, Pittsburgh adopted land value return and recycling. It phased in this two-rate or split-rate property tax over a period of 5 years. After the adoption of this two-rate property tax, Pittsburgh became a manufacturing giant. And yet, in spite of the robust business growth and employment growth in Pittsburgh, housing prices in Pittsburgh were relatively modest compared to other cities that had booming economies. And I think the property tax that they had there, which practiced land value return, is partly responsible. Another interesting phenomenon is that during the Great Depression, many major cities saw declines in assessed value by between 21 and 58%. In Pittsburgh, during the Great Depression of the 1930s, assessed values declined by only 11%. Why? Well, again, it goes back to the fact that by practicing land value return, Pittsburgh was discouraging population. Somebody just could they mute your mic? I hear a dog in the background. So most of the country in the 1920s experienced a real estate speculation boom and bust. that actually helped drive the country into the Great Depression. But Pittsburgh, because they didn't encourage speculation, therefore they didn't have the huge boom of real estate prices, and also avoided the big bust. So land value return and recycling didn't eliminate the hardship of the Depression in Pittsburgh, but it certainly made it a lot more modest than it was elsewhere. Sticking with the Pittsburgh example, during the 1970s, Pittsburgh experienced a $200 million budget shortfall. The mayor at the time proposed a wage tax to close the gap. Now, this wage tax would have cost the average Pittsburgh family about $200 a year, and members of the city council were very much afraid that jobs and families would leave Pittsburgh as a result. So they, the council, took a different approach. They decided to increase the land portion of the property tax. And as a result, they raised the same amount of money, but it only cost the average family $80 a year. Why? Well, most of the valuable land in Pittsburgh was owned not by homeowners, but by corporations in the commercial downtown. So in this way, they were able to close the budget gap without creating a hardship for Pittsburgh families. But many experts were worried that this higher tax on downtown land would chase businesses away. So what happened? Well, in the early 1980s, after they increased the tax on land, Pittsburgh experienced something that people called Renaissance 2, with massive amounts of new development and new corporate headquarters in the downtown. During the 1980s, well, let me just stick with that. So by increasing the tax on downtown land, many of the corporate owners there decided to develop their land more intensely. So rather than leave, they actually developed more intensely. Later during the 1980s, many steel and manufacturing plants closed in Pittsburgh and the surrounding area. Tens of thousands of jobs were lost. In spite of that, and in spite of the fact that Pittsburgh did suffer a lot from that, Pittsburgh outperformed other Rust Belt cities by far. I mean, you can go to places like Cleveland or Buffalo or Akron or Toledo, Gary, Indiana. You see downtowns that look like they've been bombed out in a war. Pittsburgh, not so much. And let's think about why. In many cities, when a factory closes, the assessment goes down. And it then becomes very inexpensive for the owner of that land to simply sit and wait, perhaps for economic recovery assistance from the state or the federal government. And unfortunately, while they're sitting and waiting, that economic recovery assistance might never come. Now in Pittsburgh, surely when the factories closed, the assessment of those factories went down. But because the tax bill was based mostly on land value, which remained constant, their taxes continued to remain high. This motivated the landowners to put their land back into productive use or sell to somebody who would. Disaster recovery, number 2. In 1972, Hurricane Agnes caused the Susquehanna River to flood Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. For those of you who aren't aware of Harrisburg, it's the state capital in Pennsylvania. Middle-class whites were also leaving downtown for the suburbs, and this was happening all across the country at that time. In the mid-1970s, there were over 5,000 vacant and boarded up properties in Harrisburg's downtown, and Harrisburg was called by some as one of the worst cities of its size in the country. In 1975, at the urging of Harrisburg's mayor, they adopted a 2-rate or split-rate property tax. Lower tax on buildings, higher tax on land. And by the late 1980s and early 1990s, the number of vacant properties had been reduced to a few hundred. Harrisburg was reclassified as one of the most livable cities of its size in the country. And it should be noted that this rejuvenation during the late 1980s and early 1990s happened well in advance of the Back to the City movement that we've all heard about recently, which didn't really get started until the early 2000s. Now I'll talk about an example of economic resilience. You know, in the social science, controlled experiments are very rare. We might implement a new policy and change will occur and we'll measure that change. But at the end of the day, did the change we see, was that caused by the policy change or would it have happened anyway? It's very hard to know. In the Pittsburgh area, we had an unusual circumstance where we almost had a controlled experiment. McKeesport, Duquesne, and Clairton are all very similar steel towns in the Pittsburgh region, just upriver from Pittsburgh. They each have Eastern European populations that were primarily factory workers. And yet, by the mid-1970s, each town's steel mill had closed down. The number and value of building permits declined in each city for several consecutive years as a result of their steel plants closing down. McKeesport, in the mid to late 1970s, adopted a two-rate property tax. And as we've discussed from prior classes, the theory would indicate that this would result in more building activity. And indeed, building permits increased for 3 consecutive years after they made this change. But would this have happened anyway? Well, we can find out by looking at what happened nearby in McKeesport and Duquesne. Duquesne and Clairton kept their traditional property taxes in place, and building permits continued to decline in these cities while they were increasing in McKeesport. And again, these cities are subject to the same economy. They're in the same region. They're all manufacturing cities. I think this is pretty clear case that it's the property tax change that helped McKeesport come around. And indeed, and you can see here, this is looking at what happened in building permits compared 3 years before the change to 3 years after. In McKeesport, building permits went up by 38%, but in Duquesne, they continued to decline by 20%, and by 28%, they declined in nearby Clairton. Well, Duquesne and Clairton noticed what was going on in McKeesport, and they adopted the two-rate tax defensively. Shortly thereafter, the number of building permits began to rise in these cities as well. Now, one final note before I leave this example. If you go to McKeesport, Duquesne, or Clairton today, you will see that these are very distressed cities. The property tax reform that they enacted did not bring back the steel factories and did not bring back the thousands of good-paying manufacturing jobs that these factories provided. But what this experiment shows is that at whatever stage of the business cycle a community is in, and even during the depths of a recession or depression, land value return and recycling can help a community's economy operate at a higher level than it otherwise would. The next example is yet another example of what I call development-oriented transit. In Washington, D.C., we have a metro rail subway system. The Red Line is one of the busiest transit lines in that system. And when the system was originally constructed in the 1970s, if you're going from downtown out on the Red Line, from Union Station, the next station out was at Rhode Island Avenue, which is about 2 miles away, which is a very long distance between stations in an urban area. Well, the reason that no station was built in between was because that area in between was very derelict, pretty much empty industrial land with very few homes or places of employment. And I guess the thinking when the system was originally designed and built was, why put a station where there is no activity? In the 1990s, the district's downtown was booming, And some of the landowners in this area wanted to put up office buildings. Their request for building permits was denied, and the landowners were astonished and requested an explanation. And let me show you some satellite pictures to help you understand the area we're talking about. This picture, I think, dates from probably the late 1980s, or this picture dates from a little early, later than that. But this shows the railroad tracks that go to Union Station. This is Union Station here. The Capitol is off the map to the south. These two buildings here are the Senate office buildings. So here's Union Station, the railroad station. This is Rhode Island Avenue. So here there was a Metro rail station, and then here was another one, and nothing in between. This road is New York Avenue, a major thoroughfare, major entry into the district. If you continue going to the left, you end up at the White House.
Rick, can you use the highlighted pointer to make it more visible, because the little white arrow is a little bit difficult to follow?
Okay, let me see if I can do that. Thank you for that comment. Is this better?
Yes, this is, and also there is an option that you can draw and the line disappears. So if you draw a line, it shows it and then it disappears, so it doesn't clog your...
Oh, well, I'll have to play with that later, but thank you for your help. So this is the rail line. This is the Union Station right here. These are the Senate office buildings. The Capitol is just off the map to the south. Rhode Island Avenue is here. So there was a station here, and there was a station here, and nothing in between. A lot of the land along here is on the west side of the tracks is empty, because during the early and mid 1900s, there were freight railroad tracks here where the freight railroads offloaded their freight. That activity stopped in the 1960s, and that land just laid empty. And during the 1970s and 80s also, it was just empty land. I'll show you a closer view. So here we have a closer view. Here's Union Station. This is New York Avenue. This is Florida Avenue. And this is North Capitol Street. And you can see there's empty land. Well, there's a gas station right here, and this land is empty. All of this land is empty. This land was used by our Department of Public Works for staging dump trucks, snow plows. There was a salt dome there, but otherwise pretty empty. Nothing was here. This is one of the few buildings that was in this area. This is the Woody's department store warehouse. There was a rail line that actually, a rail spur that went right into the warehouse for unloading of freight. This was the Greyhound bus station. But you can see lots of vacant land, parking lot, parking lot, parking lot, parking lot, parking lot. So lots of vacant land. So as I mentioned, the owners of that vacant land wanted building permits. They couldn't get their permit, and they went to the permit officer to say, why not? And what the permit officer said was, well, you know, the only way to get to the office, if you put office buildings in this area, the only way to get to them are by New York Avenue, North Capitol Street, and Florida Avenue. And these streets are already overfull of traffic at rush hour. It would be very irresponsible for us, the permit office, to load more traffic onto these already congested streets. But we can't help but notice that, gee, the Red Line subway runs right past these properties. If only there was a station in this area, we would reconsider. Well, not surprisingly, the landowners decided to have a meeting with the DC Department of Transportation. And I happened to attend that meeting. And they said, you know, we need a new metro rail station to be built at this location in order to have our development. And what I told the landowners was that we would love to do this. But this was 1998, And in 1997, the district had essentially just gone bankrupt. The Congress had appointed something that was called a control board to monitor and control all our spending. So I said, you know, we're really not in a position to spend millions of dollars to build a new transit station. Furthermore, if a metro rail station was created at this location, the value of your land would go up substantially. And if you landowners want a metro station here, you're going to have to pay for it. Well, the landowners looked very unhappy when I said this and pretty much ended the meeting. When the transit director and I walked back to our office, he said, "Gee, Rick, I'm surprised they didn't beat you up." I said, "Me too." Well, several months went by and we heard absolutely nothing. And then suddenly, from out of the blue, there was an announcement from the mayor's office that the landowners had offered $25 million for a new metro rail station at New York and Florida Avenues. Well, that's kind of interesting. The landowners didn't come back to me because if they had offered me $25 million, I would have figured it was worth more than what they were offering. So instead, they went right to the mayor's office. And the mayor's office, well, those people were just astonished that private landowners would offer private money for public infrastructure. This seemingly unheard of, and they just said, "Thank you very much." So what happened was the District of Columbia created a special assessment district, and the district sold a bond for $25 million. And the landowners, people who owned land in the special assessment district, paid an additional property tax every year for 25 years to pay off the debt service on that bond. Now, because the land within the special assessment district was mostly vacant land, the special assessment was based almost entirely on land value and therefore constitutes land value return. Now, in a separate transaction, the adjacent landowners also paid for the construction of new streets that were necessary. And the reason that we got the private landowners to pay for them, again, rather than general taxpayers, is because these streets kind of dead-ended at the railroad tracks. And therefore, these street segments primarily provided access to the private property rather than sort of advancing the street grid. So let me just show you again a map of the area. So this shows New York. This is New York Avenue here. This is Florida Avenue. This is where the new station was going to be built between Florida Avenue and this is M as in Mary Street. And the special assessment district included roughly this area. It exempted any homeowners. There were very few homeowners in this area, mostly all commercial land. And we did build some new street segments. So this is N Street right here. N Street stopped right here before we built the subway station. Well, we extended N Street to here, and then we extended 2nd Street northeast here. And we got these landowners to pay for it. Again, because these streets sort of stop here because of the railroad tracks, they don't really connect to the street grid. They just primarily served as entrance, egress, and access for these properties. Now, this is a picture before, well, actually during, you can see the station beginning to take shape and some construction activity here. This shows that same area a few years later. This, again, this is Florida Avenue, New York Avenue, and this is M Street. So here's the station. This empty land, or previously empty land, became the headquarters for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. They had several satellite offices scattered around the city, and they wanted to consolidate. Virginia and Maryland tried to woo them over there, but we said, wouldn't you like to have an office right at a subway stop? And they said yes. Here is this little spur of 2nd Street that we built, and there's a building here that's a hotel right next to the tracks. Here, this was all empty land. This is now mixed-use development, offices and retail. This empty spot here has been filled in. This is the Woody's warehouse. This was there before. And as you can see, there are new office buildings going up here as well. This is, oh, let me go back so you can understand this picture. Imagine yourself in a helicopter right about here, looking in this direction. So you're looking south, southwest, if you will, toward the Capitol in this direction. So this is a rendering. Again, this is where that little gas station was. This triangle was totally empty. This building exists. This building is under construction. Here's the hotel that was built. There you can barely see part of 2nd Street, and N Street runs there. This is the new headquarters for ATF. And here's a whole array of private office buildings, apartments, condos, offices, retail shops, etc. So that's why I call this development-oriented transit. We created the transit station to induce development. And this is a street level view of some of the new development. This is 1st Street. And one of the things I wanted to show off was our new stormwater system. As you know, the streets and the buildings are impervious surfaces. They generate a lot of stormwater during rain events. And in Washington, D.C., we had a lot of flooding in low-lying areas because our combined sewer system, both sanitary sewer and stormwater sewers were combined. And then during rain events, there would be a lot of, the system simply couldn't handle all the flow, and there was a lot of flooding. So as this area was redeveloped, the storm drains were reconfigured. Now rainwater in the street goes through little channels under the sidewalk into this area of plantings. It waters trees and shrubs. These are sort of desert-loving plants that are dry most of the time, but when there's a rain event, water floods this area, feeds those plants, gets filtered through layers of soil and sand, and then if there's any left over, it goes into the storm sewer system, but at much less volume and with much less pollution. So this is a way in which we've taken advantage of new infrastructure development to improve the environment. Our next example, again, development-oriented transit, leaves the United States and goes to Hong Kong. A lot of people think of Hong Kong as sort of the motherland of capitalism, but people often don't realize this. Who owns all the land in Hong Kong? Hong Kong owns all the land in Hong Kong. Now, when its subway system was being developed, Hong Kong sold land above and around where the stations would be to the Transit Authority. So the Transit Authority purchased this land at pre-subway prices. But once the subway was built, the Transit Authority leased their land to developers at very high prices, who then built skyscrapers over and around the stations. Now, the MTA, the Hong Kong Transit Authority, is one of the few, if not the only, profitable transit authorities in the world. Now, I don't know about the people in our audience, but I think if you ask the average person on the street, does transit make money? Most people just assume that transit loses money and has to be subsidized. But as we showed in our example of the Chevy Chase streetcar, there it was privately provided and made money. Now, the streetcar operation itself didn't make money except because there was land value capture that the landowner controlled. Here in Hong Kong, we have the same principle at work. Yes, it's true. Hong Kong is ideal for transit. It's very dense, and so you've got a lot of people going the same direction at the same time. So transit operations are very efficient in Hong Kong, no doubt about that. But they're also making a lot of money by returning and recycling that transit-created land value. It's coming right back to the transit authority that created it. So land value return and recycling provides more than just transit, because every time that Hong Kong makes itself more productive or more livable, land values rise in Hong Kong. And these values come back to Hong Kong in terms of higher lease payments whenever the land leases are renewed. And these leases that they give to developers are typically for very long periods of time. And we're talking about either 50 or 99-year leases. So there are many more examples that we could find of land value return and recycling, but I think I've thrown enough out there for you to get a sense that land value return and recycling is not just some weird economic theory. It's actually used in everyday examples, both in this country and around the world, to good effect. And so it is a real and viable policy solution to some of the problems that we experience in terms of job creation, in terms of affordable housing, and in terms of creating more compact and sustainable development. So at this point, I should mention that there are more examples in this guidebook that I helped write. It's called the Guidebook for Funding Transportation Through Land Value Return and Recycling. This guidebook was published by the Transportation Research Board, which is part of the National Academy of Sciences. It's NCHRP report number 873, and there's a link to it there that, again, I think will make these slides available after the end of the course, so you'll be able to access that guidebook if you so desire. So that completes our formal presentation for this evening. And at this point, Ibrahima, you can start calling on people if they have questions.
Thank you, Rick. You may now open your mics and we shall go ahead. Who has a question? I see Marty Rowland raising his hand. Go ahead, Marty.
Okay, thanks, Ibrahima and Rick. It was excellent to talk. I really enjoyed the personal stories and your involvement in something that really worked. But on that example, I was curious that once the buildings got put up, and because DC doesn't have a split rate, what's the effect now that buildings are being taxed? Do you see something negative or something that's less positive than it would be otherwise?
Well, that's a very good question. And I obviously, for the sake of our presentation, I compressed this story. There's an interesting sidelight, which I think speaks to your concern. So what we did was we put a special additional tax on the land around the subway station that the landowners had to pay. And as the station was under construction, and before the development that you see here, while that was still in the planning stages, the landowners came back to the city and they said, you know, once the station is finished and in operation, the assessment of our property is going to go up and our regular property taxes are going to go up as well. So we're going to end up paying twice for the station. We're paying once in the special assessment, but then we're going to pay a second time because of higher land values. We should get a credit against any future increase in our property taxes based on the special assessment that we're making. Now, this is an argument that the landowners made to the mayor's economic development office. And the fellow there said, well, that makes a lot of sense. I think that's reasonable. And I went up to this guy, I said, it's absolutely not reasonable. I said, if you agree to their demand, then all that will have happened is that they will have paid in advance taxes that they would have paid anyway, but there's no real value capture. And he said, well, I don't know. They're saying that they're going to be taxed twice for the same thing, and that kind of seems reasonable. I said, it's absolutely not true. And we went back and forth several times. Finally, he agreed to hire an economist to do an econometric study. And he looked at this area, what the landowners were paying, both in regular tax and in special assessment tax. And then he looked at a low, middle, and high development scenario. And under a middle development scenario, he found out that the additional profit that the landowners were making as a result of the increase in value and the increase in development, the landowners were going to make 12 times the amount that they were paying through the special assessment. So there was no way that just allowing the property tax to increase was going to cause them to lose money or pay twice. Not even close. So as I said, if they had come to me with their offer to pay $25 million, I would have said, well, you really should pony up a bit more than that. So they got a good deal, but it did establish a precedent. And again, the demand for real estate is so strong in the district, or at least it was up until the pandemic, that they're making good money on the returns for these buildings. Now, it's true that the tax that's being assessed on these buildings is a disincentive in terms of long-term maintenance and improvement of those buildings. And indeed, what we've seen historically in downtowns is that when buildings are put up and new, you know, the property tax isn't that big of a problem because maintenance on a new building is fairly low. But as these buildings age and the maintenance and rehabilitation needs go up, then the tax becomes more onerous. So at least at the present time, there has not been any deleterious impact, or at least visibly so, of the tax on buildings. I hope that answers your question.
No, that was good. Thank you.
Ibrahima, who's next up?
Anis, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Rick. This is great. All these examples. And before I ask my question, is that econometric report somewhere available? Could you get your hands on it? Because it would be interesting to see how it was done. Because it could be possibly made in many other cases. And actually, this brings me exactly to my point. Okay, that your project is not land value return, and I will explain why. Because as you said, the landlords kept charging exorbitant land values, which we call rents. Afterwards, they made 12 times more, but you didn't think to go back and tax that enormous land value. And that goes back also to my criticism of this infatuation of not just you, most Georges you hear, Joshua Vincent, Marty Rowland, many Georges, when they talk about land value return proposals, the only thing they talk about is like vacant lots. And if you really think about it, you push more vacant lots into these high rent extraction schemes. So you're working for the landlords in the end. Sure, that there is development that's happening, but remember, that development is paid for dearly by the consumers and the tenants of these newly developed districts. And I haven't heard any way of addressing that. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate your comments, Yanis, and I think what the examples that I've presented show is that there's a wide array of land value return. Some of it is very weak, and some of it is very robust. Certainly from my perspective, and I think from the perspective of others, the more robust, the better. Now, in this particular case, for the New York Avenue Metro station, it's now called the NOMA Metro Station, and as you're looking at it, this is the station right here. You know, the landowners came to the mayor's office with a proposal to contribute $25 million. I think they should have paid a lot more than that, but they didn't come to me, so that was the deal. And then they wanted to water down the deal by getting a credit for what they were paying in special assessment against their regular property tax. And I prevented that from happening, which I think was a good thing. But still, the fact remains that the landowners got a very good deal in this area. They made a lot more money than they paid, and our metro system probably could use that money more than the landowners. So that's unfortunate. But I think if you look, for example, at the Hong Kong example, or if you look at well, for example, the Chevy Chase Land Company, again, land value return and recycling was more robust there because the landowner recouped all the value in the land rather than just a small part of it. So that's the deal there. Now, I think, again, as I mentioned last week, and I think the week before as well, the term rent is very confusing because when economists talk about rent, they're talking about the return on a fixed, something a fixed supply like land or natural resources. But in everyday parlance, we talk about rent as something we give to our landlord. And part of that rent is compensation for access to land. And part of it is compensation for the building that they build and maintain that we use. And so that gets a little confusing. Certainly to the extent that an entity is creating and maintaining a building that we use, we have to pay those costs. Now, I live in a cooperative housing building in Washington, D.C. So all of us who live in this building, we own our building. But that doesn't mean we don't pay anything every month. Every month we pay a lot of money to maintain the old pipes and the furnace and the water heater and the roof, and the list goes, do daily cleaning and trash takeout. I mean, there are a lot of expenses that we have to pay. So certain payments are justified. And I don't have a problem about paying for those types of things.
Right.
I hope I've conveyed that land value return can go from being very weak to being very strong. And how it turns out, I think the more robust it is, the more social benefits there are, both in terms of affordable housing, job creation, and sustainable development. But how robust the implementation is depends on the political process of implementation. And that is our topic for next week. Ibrahima, who's up next?
Ed Dodson?
Oh, hi, Rick. Great talk. When you were talking about initially the extension of that rail line out of DC, it reminded me of Reston and Columbia as new towns. And I wondered if you'd comment about what rate of implementation of collecting the land rent you think is appropriate when an entity is created out of nothing, not just a rail line, but all the infrastructure, the public, libraries, municipal buildings, everything is built, from scratch by the entity, whether it's corporate or otherwise.
Well, my thinking, and to me, this is the same answer for new cities and old cities, is that when value is created, the entity that creates the value should get it. So if a new community is created and it creates value in land by providing schools and water and sewer and streets and libraries and hospitals and on and on and on, well, and transit, then that value that's created should come back to the entity that creates it. That's my thinking in terms of ethical economics, if you will. And I think that when we don't do that, we create incentives for bad behavior. I mean, one of the things we talked about in our very first class was reality TV, where we put people in a situation and we give them incentives to behave badly. And what do? They behave badly. And some of us find that fascinating to watch. Me, not so much. But regardless of whether that's good or bad entertainment, we shouldn't be doing that in real life, and yet we do.
Well,
In real life, we get very little return, as Janice was suggesting. We get very little return for the value that our public infrastructure creates. We give most of that away to people who are simply lucky or shrewd enough to be in a position to extract it. And by giving that much value away for nothing, we encourage land speculation, which is a parasitic activity, which induces sprawl. That was our very first class where we talked about the infrastructure conundrum. People who are holding land that benefits from infrastructure, if they don't have to pay for it, they have very little incentive to develop. And they say, well, my land is worth more today than it was yesterday, but it might be worth even more tomorrow, so I'll just sit and wait. So if we hadn't done value capture in this area, you might see a building here, a building there, but a lot of vacant land today. Instead, because of land value return, those landowners weren't going to be paying millions of dollars and getting nothing back. So they had an incentive to develop very quickly after the station was developed. So, and then on the other hand, we, as I think Marty Rowland was talking about, the tax that we impose on these buildings. And like I said, when the building is brand new and it's bringing in rents and the cost of maintenance are low, the tax on the building is not good, but it's not critical. But as these buildings get older and the cost of maintaining them goes up, the tax on building values encourages landowners to allow their buildings to deteriorate, become slums. And this is not good for social progress. So we have incentives that are upside down that need to be turned right side up. And this is true whether we're in an existing community or, as you suggested, Ed, in one of these brand new communities that are created from scratch. And I think if you look at well, I think if you look at the Chevy Chase Land Company example, that's really an interesting example. Chevy Chase Land Company created a new community, still called Chevy Chase to this day, out in Northwest DC. They bought cheap land. They put in Connecticut Avenue at their own expense. They bought a controlling share in the Rock Creek Railroad Company, which built the streetcar, again, at their own expense. And they charged people a few pennies to ride the streetcar. But what happened was the value of their land went way up, and that's how they recouped their cost. Now, it's very unusual to have a private landowner who can internalize all the externalities associated with land value return and recycling. But that's the principle, and it should apply regardless of, you know, whether it's privately owned or publicly owned.
Rick, I may be misinterpreted what you said earlier, or I didn't ask my question quite correctly. The difference that I'm thinking about is that in the case of, let's say, Columbia, the entire land area was not a municipality at all. It was located in a county. So a private company comes in and builds all of the infrastructure, and then eventually at some point, a municipality is created. And you have a school district and all that. So you start out, Columbia starts out with a county tax on real estate, but no borough tax, no city tax, no school district taxes. And my question was, you know, at what point does the entity, the private entity that owns the land become responsible to pay the full rental value of the land to whatever governmental entity that is now created?
Well, I'm not as much of an expert on Columbia as I need to be to answer this question. For people in the audience who don't know where Columbia, Maryland is, it's a city that was created from scratch. It's located halfway between Baltimore and Washington, D.C., and it was created by a developer named Rouse. He was a famous developer. He's passed away, but he was very famous for redeveloping Faneuil Hall in Boston and some other high-profile developments in the 1960s and 70s. He wanted, like many developers, he thought, you know, so many of our cities are burdened with all these historical problems. What if we could start a new city from scratch without problems and create a little utopia? So that's what he tried to do. He bought up farmland in between DC and Baltimore and then tried to create a city there. And his corporation that started Columbia and started developing infrastructure started collecting taxes, I assume, on the value it created. Now, again, they employ a traditional property tax. So they're getting relatively little return on their investment. Now, initially, when they sold their first lots for homes or businesses, and Columbia has a little downtown, the private corporation that created Columbia was able to recoup its investment in infrastructure just the way the Chevy Chase Land Company did. So they bought farmland that was valued at whatever the price of land was per acre to grow corn and transformed it into land that was valued per square foot as a potential home site or business site. Now, going forward, one could think that once the corporation has sold off its land and recouped its investment, then the city ends up with an aging infrastructure for which it doesn't get enough income and taxes to maintain over time. And I think that's a problem. So that's a situation that you need to deal with over time. And that's why I think the Hong Kong example is really interesting. And actually in Washington, D.C., there's some of this also. The Metro Rail system does own some of the land adjacent to or air rights above its station. And once its station is completed, Metro could sell this land or air rights to a developer. That would be a one-time infusion of cash, and that would be it. Metro doesn't do that. Instead, they lease their land, I think for either, again, 50 or 99 years. And then at the end of that time, the lease ends and the lease can be renewed or not. But if it's renewed, it's going to be renewed at current market price. That way, Metro, instead of getting a one-shot infusion of cash, gets continual income in perpetuity that reflects the value it creates on that property. And I think cities should do this too. Land should be leased and not sold. And that's why I think Hong Kong is potentially a better example for American cities, something to be emulated, rather than our typical situation where public may get some land through urban renewal and then sell it off. Well, assuming that it sells it at market price, and that doesn't always happen, sometimes there's a sweetheart deal and corruption. That's another problem with land sales. It induces corruption. But if instead they lease their land at market rates, then over time, they would get a fair return on the value they're creating through the infrastructure they provide. Am I more to your point there, Ed?
Yeah, this is one of the complexities that I've always, thought about in terms of gradual implementation to get to where we ultimately need to be in terms of public policy.
Right. Well, we'll talk more about implementation next week.
Okay. Thanks, Rick.
Ibrahima, who's next?
Great. I see Dennis raising his hand. Dennis Strait. Are you still here, Dennis?
I am. I hope you can hear me all right. I've got a piano lesson going on in the background.
Okay. Go ahead.
So, Rick, I was wondering, this might be getting into next week, but I'm wondering if you could speculate on how a city like mine, Kansas City, Missouri, would transition to a land value return and recycling form.
Right.
And
well, that is next week. So
well, if you would describe in terms of, okay, well, I was going to ask you to describe in terms of the impact it would have on a $250,000 home in the downtown area, one in the midtown area, and one that's in the exurbs, just to get a sense about how
Right.
three of those
Well,
situations would play out.
Right. Well, in next week's show, I will give an example of how that transition can be analyzed along those terms. And the answer to your question is unique for each city. And I don't know what the average building value to land value ratio is in either Kansas City as a whole or in each neighborhood that you're talking about. But that's going to be instrumental in determining whether these properties see tax increases or reductions as part of the transition. The other thing to remember too, and again, we'll get into this next week, is that taxes and tax rates are almost infinitely plastic. And the point of these transitions is not to create windfalls and wipeouts. The point of the transition is get to a point where land stewardship is more productive for a community in the long term. But in order to get there, you have to make it politically palatable in the short term. And there are lots of techniques for doing this, and we will address this question next week. So thank you for raising it, and I'll just have to ask you to be patient.
Great. The next one is Maya.
Yeah. So my question is really, going back to the New York Avenue area. It's an area where you've got some business now. That sort of came first, and then eventually with a number of other factors playing in too. It's like mega apartment buildings, spot where so many of the younger office workers are living and commuting down to the Hill or other K Street jobs. It's like gentrification city in miniature at this point. So clearly, valuable to have activated that part of the city in general, because it was didn't have much going on for all the infrastructure that was there. But what would you have had the district do differently in the beginning or do differently now to make sure that it is actually accessible for a whole variety of incomes, especially low and moderate income folks?
Right. Well, first of all, you use the term gentrification. And gentrification, as it's typically used, talks about a situation where affluent people move into an area displacing people of lower income who are already there. And the thing to remember is that this area that we're looking at here was mostly vacant land, and the few buildings that were there were commercial. So there really wasn't anybody displaced by the development you see here. So gentrification did not happen in that sense. The District of Columbia did have laws in place when these buildings were built. We have something called inclusionary zoning. So if you build, I think it's more than 10 units, a certain percentage of the units you build have to be affordable to people who make between 80 and 120% of area and median income. Now, this doesn't help the poorest of the poor, but it does help people of modest means afford a place. And so these new buildings were subject to that law, as the best I understand.
Yeah,
Now,
it is one of the worst inclusionary zoning programs in the country. I'm pretty sure it's like 1 unit for every 10 needs to be affordable and not with much affordability.
We could have a whole show about inclusionary zoning, and it's a very tricky regulation to implement, because if you buy land when there's no requirement for inclusionary zoning, right? You're paying the landowner a big sum of money for the land. You're about to put up a development, and you've paid for the land based on your understanding of the market rate return you're going to get. And now the city comes and says, oh, we've just passed a law that says on 10% of your units, you're going to get less than market rate return. Well, now I'm kind of screwed because I've paid too much for the land. And if that's the way the regulation was implemented, the landowner would probably go to court and say, Your Honor, the city is taking my property without just compensation. And so you'll see in many cities, including Washington, where inclusionary zoning is part of the code, basically, in order for it to be implemented, developers get a density bonus to compensate them for the loss of market rate units. Again, it gets very complicated. But in terms of what I would have done differently here and throughout the city, A, land value return would have been more robust than it was. B, the tax on buildings would have been lower than it is. And while the District of Columbia does have rent control for residents, we do not have rent control for businesses. And the landlord-tenant relationship is just as pernicious, if not more so, in the commercial sector than it is in the residential sector. And I know throughout the district, there are plenty of very successful businesses that have disappeared because landlords were asking exorbitant rents that were not based on the market. And again, because we tax land too little and buildings too high, we encourage landlords to ask exorbitant rents because they're not subject to market forces the way others are, and they have deep pockets. So there are a lot of things that we could do differently here. Again, we could have a whole course on inclusionary zoning, but I think I'm going to have to leave it there for now. Ibrahima, who's up next?
Let's go, Tom.
Yes, hi Rick. Really great stuff. Quick question on, you mentioned the example of Hong Kong and others have commented that Singapore and Tokyo do the same thing. Do you have any examples in the U.S.? I know someone put on the participation board about the BART system in San Francisco, but are there many examples in the U.S. or Europe of the type of Hong Kong transit system and the way they develop?
They're finished.
Yeah, there are examples. So I mentioned earlier that Metro does control some land and air rights around its stations. Now, the amount of land and air rights that it owns compared to all the land around its station that benefits from the station is minuscule. But within the land and air rights that Metro controls, it gets a market rate return by leasing those land and air rights out to developers. So Metro is getting substantial annual income from developers who pay an annual fee to build on Metro-owned land or air rights. And Metro has a very sophisticated real estate department where they make sure they're charging market rate rents for the value of the land that they control. Trying to think. In the example that I gave earlier, you say examples in the United States. When the Chevy Chase Land Company built the streetcar line out to its subdivision, that was land value return and recycling. Now, they owned the land that benefit. This is perhaps similar to that question that somebody was asking earlier about creating a new town. That's what the Chevy Chase Land Company did. They took farmland and forest, they bought it at farm prices and forest prices. They put in urban infrastructure at their own expense, and then they reaped the reward when they sold that land at much higher prices. Now, the problem with that model is that once the private developer has sold their land, they don't care about maintaining the infrastructure. So, you know, the public sector has to think about the long-term maintenance of the infrastructure, which the private sector, they're in to make a quick killing and get out. The other thing that I think, well, let me just leave it at that. But yes, there are examples in the US where people are using land value return and recycling robustly. There was another example that didn't come to fruition, a place called Potomac Yards. It was a big railroad yard next to National Airport across the river from Washington, D.C. That was a very similar situation to here. There was a landowner who owned a big railroad yard, was empty, wanted to put up a development there, and couldn't get building permits because the only access was Route 1, which was already full of traffic. But the yellow and blue line subway went right past the property. The developer said they were going to pay 100% of the cost to build a new metro station at that location. Now that's a perfect example of land value return and recycling. There was this was in 1995, there was a big headline in the American Public Transit Association newsletter about the private developer offering to pay 100% of the cost of a new transit station. The transit station that was here, the landowner contribution was about between 30 and 33% of the cost. So there you had a landowner paying 100% of the cost. But what happened was, without showing a map of that area, but assuming that this was Route 1 and this was the rail yard, there's a homeowner community over here. And when they saw this schematic development on top of the rail yard, they said, oh, that's much too dense. It's going to draw too much traffic. Now you have to remember this was next to an airport, so none of the buildings could be very high. But these people were terrified. They asked their politicians to downzone this railroad yard so that it could only support a few stories of building. And once the politicians downzoned the land, it was no longer economical for the landowner to pay for the metro station. So he didn't. Instead, the landowner built a big shopping area there, big box shopping. So a few cinder block buildings surrounded by acres and acres of parking. It generated much more traffic than the transit-oriented development that they originally had in mind. And people who wanted to be in a development where they could have access to a subway had to go somewhere else. So that was an unfortunate situation. But we'll talk more about that next week. Ibrahima, who's next?
Yes, so there is no name, but I see iPhone. The person with the name iPhone could go ahead and ask his question.
Ibrahima, this is Marty.
Yes, hold on, Marty. Hold on, Marty.
Okay.
After him, if he's not asking, then we go to Ron, and then Marty after that.
Oh, okay. No
Yes.
problem.
Ron, go ahead.
I don't actually have a question. I was just making the point about inclusionary zoning being a economic and racial integration strategy rather than a comprehensive affordable housing strategy, which requires additional capital and operating subsidies beyond just cross subsidy between market rate and low income units. Which is so no real question, just a comment on the IZ question from earlier.
Well, that's a very good point. Thank you.
Great. Ron, are you still here?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hi, Rick.
Hi.
Hi. So one point of information and then one question. The point of information in regard to Hong Kong, little I know of the history, it's very interesting. Apparently, Britain had control of Hong Kong and they had a lease, and then the lease was going to go up at a certain point. It did, and then they had to turn the land back to Hong Kong. So that was very easy to say today, you know, Hong Kong owns the land. Once you own the land, it's very easy to do all kinds of intelligent, you know, real estate development schemes. It's very different when there's private ownership and you want to implement the same schemes because you have to jump over the heads of the private landowners. But I'm sure that probably relates to next week's issue, so I won't, you know, drag that one out. The other is a question. The question is looking at the picture. It's obvious that on the other side of the railroad tracks, it looks to me to be like a residential community. And I'm curious, when this whole tax scheme was implemented, did you segregate out, say, what was on one side of the railroad tracks, the industrial development area, and because obviously on the other side of the tracks where there was residential, their land is also going to be significantly increased. How did the city deal with that?
Okay, good question. So this is the area here on the west side of the tracks that was largely vacant land, with the exception of the Woody's warehouse that was here, and a few other small buildings, many of which have been torn down and replaced. But this was the area that was largely vacant. This area on the east side and up in this area, this is all commercial. These are all warehouses. You can see this straight line. You see the railroad tracks over here. Some of these railroad tracks go under New York Avenue and into this area. So this was a big warehouse food redistribution area. A lot of, even after railroads stopped being a primary source of freight rail, trucks, big tractor trailers would bring food in here. It would be broken down into smaller trucks and then sent out to restaurants across the city. So this was a wholesale warehouse area. This area is now being totally redeveloped along the same lines as here. Again, a lot of mixed use, residential, office, and retail all through here. This area is also commercial and industrial, and this area too. Here you see these areas. These are all residential townhouses, and there was some effort made to protect the residents by providing different types of property tax relief, so that there wouldn't be displacement. We can go more into that in our next episode. But yes, there were a number of techniques used. There are circuit breakers, tax deferrals. The way the special assessment district was drawn excluded the homeowner properties that may have fallen into the area, that sort of thing. So there are a number of techniques that can be used. Next question, Ibrahima.
Mari Roland?
Yeah, hi, Rick. So I had a question and a comment. So the question was, I hear that the metro in DC is struggling with not enough revenue, and I wanted to see what you had to say about that. But before I turn it back to you, I wanted to point out that we've got a gentleman on our board named James Kusek, who developed an excellent tool to dive really deeply into New York City real estate. And we often see boarded up buildings in valuable areas. And he uncovered in 2 different areas a practice where I guess a future developer is paying $250,000 a year just to hold the property. And it was kind of interesting because it was the exact same amount. And I'm thinking that this is the practice of the politics where, $250,000 a year is nothing. It's going to be investing billions. So have you seen that type of activity where an apparent high amount of money is stopping the low, the less powerful developer, and just kind of securing the areas for the favored few, I suppose?
Well, that's what we talked about in our first class. We called it the infrastructure conundrum, where the city built infrastructure, it created a value around that infrastructure, whether it was a road or transit. And land prices and land values started going up. And as a result, some of the landowners say, well, instead of using this land for what it's worth today, I'm going to sit and wait because it costs me nothing or very little to sit and wait. And my land is likely to be worth more tomorrow. And that's where we get into this problem of reality TV invading real life. our tax system gives people incentives to behave badly. Not that they're bad people, but when you tell people that the right thing to do goes off to the right, but the way to make money is off to the left, people are going to go to the left. People tend to do what their pocketbook tells them to do. And the thing that annoys me, and it's more than an annoyance, is that the government, by setting the rules of the game, sets the incentives. There's no reason why the incentives and the public policy objectives can't move in the same direction rather than being at cross purposes with each other. But today, we punish people who want to use land at what it's worth today, and we reward people who allow buildings to deteriorate or who simply hoard vacant land. And boarded up buildings and surface parking lots may look like there's something going on, but it's just a land speculation game.
Yeah.
So you're quite right that that is a problem. The first thing you asked was whether Metro is not making enough revenue, and the answer is yes, that's true. Our Metro Rail system in 1980 dollars cost about $10 billion to build. And a study that was done for Congress, in fact, my father, Walter Rybeck, who some of you know, was involved in this study for Congressman Henry Royce for the House Banking and Finance Committee back in the 1970s. He looked at land around the metro stations, and after factoring out general land value inflation for the region, looked at how much additional inflation was caused just by the presence of the metro station. And using very simple techniques and very conservative techniques, they determined that more than $10 billion in land value was created by this system. So if Metro had been able to recoup the value that it created, it would have been financially self-sustaining. But instead, Metro gives almost all of that value away, making millionaires and billionaires out of certain landowners, while pleading poverty and going out to the riders and the general public for subsidies. Ibrahima, who's next?
Yes, Yanis has a question, I believe.
Yes. One comment I was gonna make was back to your Pittsburgh example. And by the way, the last point you made, that your father made, is exactly, you understand that was exactly the gist of my question that I asked earlier. That we let the landlords get away with the loaves on an annual basis, and we only collect crumbs once every 3 decades or so. So in any case, so back to the Pittsburgh conundrum, because it's easy. Okay, I understand that the incentive, the landlords wanted to keep the steel companies out, but remember, the steel companies are also big, okay? And they collect rents from all over the country, okay? So for them to complain that they were being rent gouged by the local landlords in Pittsburgh, it's a little bit laughable because they've been rent gouging like the entire country on steel that was being overpriced. So, and that goes back to my first class. So we need to understand that the term rent is not real estate specific. You charge rent when you charge more than what it costs you to deliver a good or service. And the U.S. steel industry is infamous for that. Okay, Andrew Carnegie, he didn't know what to do with all the rents he collected, and then he made public libraries, which was like a few crumbs out of the big rents he collected, and we still honor him and venerate him. That's insult adding insult to injury, and we need to wake up.
Well, I think what you're talking about, I would disagree with your terms, but one of the things I try to do in this class is avoid a lot of economic jargon. And we can talk a lot about economic rent versus common parlance rent versus profit versus interest. These all have very technical definitions and would take more time than we have tonight to get into. But I think what you're talking about is a good point, which is that the steel companies, by destroying the environment through pollution and by underpaying their workers, made a lot of money and then felt perhaps a little bad about it. And so they created certain libraries and funded operas and other things to ease their conscience, if you will. But this tax reform that we're talking about is not intended to remove all the evils of society and to cure every problem. One of the things that I say often, and I'll say it tonight, and I'll certainly stress it next week, is that there are a lot of things that we need to do to improve job creation, to improve environment, and to improve housing affordability. Lots of different things that we need to do. This is not the only reform that we need. However, if we try these other things and don't do this reform, the other things that we need to do are either less effective or perhaps even counterproductive. And you may remember in the early class, we talked about the no good deed goes unpunished scenario. So you're absolutely right. The steel companies are not angels and never have been, never will be. And indeed, as a result of their mismanagement, they bankrupted their industry.
And they pulled the shaft from the working people of Pittsburgh when they could outsource steel production.
Of course.
Exactly.
So you're right. This is not the be all and end all, but this is a reform that's important. It moves society in the right direction. It does not cure all evils or all problems, but it is one important tool in our tool chest that's often overlooked or ignored. Ibrahima, who's next?
Maya, please. She has a question on.
Yeah. Hi. So totally concur that it's not the only tool that needs to be in the toolbox, but am wondering what sort of role specifically in terms of bringing rents and housing prices down it can cost. So like, do you know of examples or analysis about whether, when you add in some form of land value return on recycling, can it bring affordability down to be available to median incomes, to like 80% of median? Like, what's do we have either, theory or some examples to help indicate that?
Yes, I think this was covered in an earlier class, but let me go over it again. Property tax rates differ from place to place. Typically, they range between 1% and 2% of value. And that may not sound like a lot because we're familiar with sales taxes, which tend to be between, say, 4 and 6%. So the property tax sounds pretty minimal. How can it create a problem related to housing affordability? Well, and now I'm going to try to avoid the jargon, but I'm going to get into a little economic analysis here. The difference between the property tax and the sales tax is the sales tax you only pay once when you buy something. The property tax on an improvement like a building, you're going to pay each and every year that building adds value to the total property. Well, if you take something like a long-lived asset like a building, and you put this 1% per year tax or 2% per year tax on it in perpetuity, what's the economic impact of that? Well, economists have a tool that they call net present value, where you take a stream of payments or income that goes out into the future, and you collapse it into what would it be worth today as a one-time payment. And what you find is that this 1 or 2% payment on building value if you collapse that into a one-time payment like a sales tax, it would be equivalent to a one-time tax of between 10 and 20% on the price of construction labor and materials. So if I went to a city council and said, I know you need money, how about a 10 to 20% sales tax on construction labor and construction materials? They'd say, Rick, we need money, but that's a terrible idea. Buildings are already too expensive. This is going to make it much worse. Well, without realizing it, that's what the property tax on buildings is doing today. And some people might say, okay, so if we got rid of the property tax on buildings, depending on the rate in the jurisdiction, we might be able to reduce building costs by somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 20%. That's not insignificant. Now, the question you asked, well, who does this make housing affordable for? Well, if somebody is making zero money, a 10 to 20% reduction in the cost of housing isn't going to make housing affordable to them. And so some people, I think, wrongly jump to the conclusion that reducing the market price of housing doesn't help the poorest of the poor. And that's actually not true. And I'll tell you why. We do have programs, although they're not funded as robustly as they should be, but we do have programs for the very poor. And typically, they make up the difference between what that person can afford, and typically we define that as 30% of their income. Well, it makes up the difference between what they can afford and what the market price is. As I mentioned at the outset, these programs are not funded as robustly as they should be. But if we're able to reduce the market price of housing by 10 to 20%, we're reducing the gap between 30% of people's income and the market price. And by reducing the gap, that limited amount of money is now going to be available to help more very poor people. So even though reducing the market price of housing by itself by 10 or 20% doesn't help everybody, because of the way it interacts with deeper subsidies, it will help the poorest of the poor by making those subsidies go stretch more and help more people. On the flip side of the coin, there are pieces of land that are potentially very productive that are held out of use, that are for speculation. There are surface parking lots in our downtowns, there are boarded up buildings, there are just vacant lots in our downtowns. People should be living or working at these places. And because they're not, we've artificially constrained the supply of buildings for housing and business, and that artificially jacks up the rent. So if we had more robust land value return and recycling, more of these vacant lots would be put into use. That would expand the supply of homes and businesses and further reduce prices. So it's a very complicated question. Again, I don't think, this is not the only thing we need to do. I think there's a place for rent control, both residential and commercial in certain circumstances. In the District of Columbia, we also have a tenant right to purchase law, which helps residents purchase their units when their rental buildings are put up for sale. So there are a whole lot of things that we can do to help the people at different levels of income. And they should all be used. But again, I think this is a very instrumental technique that can go a long way in being helpful. Ibrahima, who's next?
Michael.
Yeah, hi, Rick. I just wanted to comment on the example of the Hong Kong subway, the metro. You know, Hong Kong is very much vertical. In fact, they have an escalator. It's one of the highest in the world, and it goes up and it's covered. So even when it rains, people won't get wet. And it goes up the side of a mountain up there. And so it really works well because people really can't afford cars there too. The roads there are just all one way, and you really have to know the roads well. Otherwise, it's so easy to get lost. And then the tunnel that they have is very expensive there also. So it's perfect example for a subway that, or for a metro system that works. And then also the fares are metered in a way. In other words, it's not one fare fits all, like here in New York. When you have a metro, like one fare fits all, it never makes money. You only have, if you sort of meter the fares by the distance they cover. The tube in London does that. Also, I think in Paris, they do that as well.
We do it here in Washington, D.C. as well.
Yeah, in DC, exactly.
And I talked earlier about user fees. Certainly, we made a big mistake by making roads appear to be free. And our politicians go out at rush hour and they can't understand why so many people are driving and parking in congested places at congested times. Well, we don't charge them any money for doing that, so of course they're going to do it. And there are places that have imposed congestion pricing where they charge by the level of congestion and by the distance traveled. And that has a tremendous impact on reducing automobile congestion and pollution. Likewise, in the Washington subway, we charge by the mile traveled and by time of day. So the mileage fee is heavier during the rush hour period when it's more expensive to provide transit, and cheaper during the off-peak. So that encourages people who have a choice about when to travel off-peak, and it makes our infrastructure more efficient.
Yeah, that's a good plan.
Great.
All right, thank you, Rick.
Thank you.
Gabrielle has a question.
Yes. Rick, more of a comment. As I'm exploring and doing a little bit of research of how to bring back affordable housing to some of the neighborhoods here in Chicago that desperately need it, and how do we kind of build back on the fabric that makes these neighborhoods attractive and thriving. My first analysis is that if we had in place a land value tax instead of the property taxes right now, we could bring affordable housing to almost half of the prices there are right now. This is, I mean, if we take away the cost of production that land represents right now, the way that it's being assessed and it's being used, if we transform completely the supply of affordable housing. And what I would have to say is that once we increase the supply of affordable housing, we should be expecting that rents should not be going up, because obviously there should be more supply. But there's evidence that we need to change into a more land tax value, and if we want to see affordable housing being built.
Well, thank you, Gabrielle. I appreciate your comment on that. And I do think it causes me to elaborate on my prior answer about, how does reducing the tax on buildings affect affordability? Because what I talked about was only about how reducing the tax on buildings makes buildings more affordable to construct, improve, and maintain. I didn't mention that by increasing the tax on land value, and thereby bringing more sites that are now held vacant or underutilized into use, we bring land prices down at the same time. So I think you're right that the impact on affordability for both residential and commercial purposes could be very robust. But we need to get to that point of implementation to see that. But it does bear out, if you do the mathematics of it, it can be very robust. Thank you for your comment.
Thank
you. Ibrahima, do we have anybody, or is it time to
I believe Ed Dodson has a question.
Rick, in Pennsylvania, the Constitution has been amended a couple of times to expand authority for communities to implement two-rate property taxes, and that includes now a couple school districts. And what's always been a challenge for me as an activist promoting this idea has been the large number of local tax jurisdictions that that impose tax rates on real estate, and the school districts almost everywhere collect most or the largest portion of the property tax. And I'm just wondering, is there a particular approach to school districts that would appeal to them to either implement a two-rate property tax or seek authority from their state legislature to do so?
That's an interesting question, and it really goes to an issue that's sort of front and center today, which is how segregated many of our communities are, and problems of poverty. And some people mistakenly think that segregation just happened because people wanted to be with their own kind or some such thing. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Certainly, there's always some level of self-segregation, but the segregation that we see in most American cities was created by government policy. So there's a wonderful book out, which I commend to the audience, called The Color of Law. And it talks about how mortgage regulations from the 1930s redlined certain areas and made mortgages unavailable to neighborhoods where there was a high percentage of minority population. And it created a lot of very bad and inequitable results. And on top of that, you then have school districts funded not at large, but by property taxes, which means that a low-income neighborhood or community ends up with less money for its school than a more affluent community or neighborhood. So there are some very, again, when we talk about incentives for people to behave badly, funding schools via property tax does not encourage civic-minded behavior. And we need, I think that while it's true that good schools do create land value, and I think they should get their return on that, I would look for a broader source of funding for schools than just what can be gained from property taxes. But that, again, that's a course in itself right there.
Rick,
and I have not looked at the politics of how you get school boards interested in this reform. That's something that I have not looked at.
I should tell you something interesting happened the other day. There's a news program called Vice News. Do you watch that or ever see it?
I think I've seen it once or twice.
Okay, I would recommend it to everyone if you get it, because they really do some hard-hitting analysis and stories. But anyway, they featured Charlotte, North Carolina, and the segregation that exists in that city. And the planner was talking about changes in zoning to create more mixed-use development. They didn't touch on really anything about the tax base and how revenue should be raised. So I sat down and wrote a long email to the mayor of Charlotte. If the mayor responds, I'll let you know.
Okay.
How is that program called, Ed? Could you repeat it again?
Vice News.
Okay, thank you.
Well, we're going to get into this. This is really the bread and butter for next week, which is, if this is such a good idea, what are the opportunities and impediments for more robust implementation? And we'll dive deeply into that next week. But that's really the key. I mean, hopefully the people who've been attending so far think, well, this is probably a pretty interesting idea. But an interesting idea that doesn't get implemented isn't that good an idea in my book. So we need to look at the implementation issues very closely, and that's going to be the bread and butter of next week. Is that a place to end, Ibrahima, or do we have other people with questions or comments?
This is perfect. It's exactly 8:31.
Great. Well, again, I want to thank everybody for attending and for participating. I hope that what we've said makes a little sense and clears up some of the fog that often surrounds economic ideas. And hopefully next week we can get into the sort of the nitty-gritty of how we take this interesting idea and make it happen. As we could see today, there are places where it is happening, but you know, oftentimes people are unaware of it being implemented or having good effect. So what can we do to make implementation more robust and improve job creation, affordability, and sustainability in our communities going forward? Thank you all very much, and I wish everyone a good evening. Looking forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Rick. Great job.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks, everyone.